Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 225, Alexandrina Askew. Part 1. An article featured in the Illustrated Australian News in November 1867 titled A Lady Swindler. It appears that for a length of time the lady has been in the habit of visiting lodging houses and inquiring for apartments. Having agreed to take the lodgings, she proceeds to pay a deposit when, on feeling in her pocket, she cries, "I've lost my purse, they've stolen my purse," and forthwith commences to lament and bemoan her loss, exclaiming, "What shall I do? What will my husband say?" The lady is always accompanied by a little boy dressed in a Highland costume, whose tears, mingled with the sobs of his mother, are the secret of the facility with which she accomplishes her schemes. The lady swindler was Mrs Alexandrina Askew. She didn't ask for money. Loans were offered in her time of crisis. As she collected more funds, her clothes became more ladylike. Outside Melbourne, she would suddenly appear from the bush and dematerialise back into it afterwards. Throughout all of her forays, she insisted that her husband was a wealthy squatter near Piggereet, southwest of Ballarat, and that he had 30,000 sheep and 900 head of cattle. Alexandrina also used the name Alice and an alias Jemima Mackenzie, but her birth name was Alexandrina Grant. According to her court record, she was born in 1827 in Rossshire and spent most of her life in Speyside. She was tried at the Aberdeen Court of Judiciary on the 25th of September 1844 and pled not guilty. She received 7 years' transportation to Van Diemen's Land. Her crime was falsehoods, fraud and wilful imposition in obtaining a dress and a shawl and using a false name, Jemima Mackenzie. She was described as a good-looking girl of a rather genteel appearance. This girl is well known throughout Inverness in taking advantage of people of rank and importance. It was noted that her misdemeanours were quite amusing, not only for their credulity, but for the ingenuity of them. She'd previously been convicted in Aberdeen the year before for fraudulently obtaining a pair of gloves and a lace collar from Mrs Lindsay. Alexandrina came to her in the May of 1844 and took lodgings at her house. She said she'd arrived that morning from England, where her father was a general officer who'd sent her to Scotland for her education. She said she had an uncle, Mr Smith, who was a land surveyor in Inverness, and that she was visiting her uncle after breakfast. Mrs Lindsay loaned her the gloves and collar to visit him. She asked the landlady to have a boy accompany her, which Alexandrina gave the slip, and Alexandrina disappeared. In the June of 1844, she called into a shop in Old Aberdeen and told the woman who owned the business that she was the daughter of General Cruikshank in the West Country and was residing at Mrs Sutherland's cottage. She purchased some small articles, including a piece of ribbon and a napkin. She put the ribbon under her bonnet and then expressed her regret at having forgotten her purse. She said she would call at night and pay for the goods. Mrs MacDonald, however, did not allow her to take her purchases away. Alexandrina did not return to pay for the ribbon, and Mrs MacDonald searched for her and found her in a house at Gallowgate. Alexandrina gave her a bonnet as a token of payment, but the payment was not received. Also in the June of 1844, Alexandrina met with the wife of a pawnbroker and asked the woman if she could get lodgings for the night, as she was unable to go to her own lodgings at that hour of the night, which she said was Mrs Sutherland's cottages. The wife said her husband was from Narnshire, and Alexandrina said she was also from there and she'd like to meet him. She said her name was Miss Cruikshank, the daughter of General Cruikshank of Pluscarden. She was put up for the night. She obtained articles to the value of £2 and 10 shillings from the shop and said she would pay for them the next day. The next morning, accompanied by her host's daughter, she went to Mrs Sutherland's cottage to obtain her purse, but on reaching the gate, she said the Sutherlands didn't like being disturbed on a Sunday, and she disappeared at Spittal. Mr Sutherland said he'd never seen Alexandrina before. On the next 3 charges, she used the same ruse by obtaining lodgings and saying she was the daughter of a notable man and induced the parties to give credit to her. She used Major Grant, a barrack master, as her father's name at these lodgings and obtained articles such as shawls and umbrellas.
The 7th charge was when she went into a public house run by Mrs Ewing and asked for lodgings, and again stated her father was Major Grant. The next morning she borrowed a shawl from Mrs Ewing on exchange for her own, and asked Mrs Ewing to accompany her to her father's house, as he would be unhappy that she'd stayed at an alehouse. She asked Mrs Ewing to go ahead to speak to her father at the barracks. When Mrs Ewing inquired, she was told the Major and his family had been for a time absent in the country. When Mrs Ewing returned to the spot they had parted, Alexandrina was nowhere to be found. Questioned later, Major Grant said he did not know Alexandrina. Alexandrina was tracked down and arrested on the 17th of June 1844. She was in jail for 3 months prior to her trial. In jail she gave differing facts. One was that her father was a Mr Grant, but he was a farmer from Grantown. But in another she stated her name was Mackenzie, not Grant, and she was the daughter of a man from Narnshire. She further confessed that she'd been convicted twice before at Inverness under the name of Jemima Mackenzie. She also reported that she'd served 6 months for leaving my place, that is, leaving her position as a servant while under contract. Her status was single, and she also stated that she'd spent 2 years on the town, so in other words, prostitution. On her convict record, it stated that she was 18 and born at Inverness in Scotland. The trial record states she was born in jail to convicts who both had been transported. She survived using her fraudulent activities. Her counsel, Mr Irvine, pleaded lack of evidence. She was charged with the first 6 charges and acquitted on the 7th. Her description at the time of her trial was 5 foot 2 inches tall, a freckled, sallow complexion, light brown hair, grey eyes, sharp nose and a round, long chin. She was sent to Millbank Prison on the 15th of October 1844 from Aberdeen Jail, and on the 7th of December 1844 she petitioned her sentence, saying she'd been in service for 10 years, she left home due to her stepfather being unkind to her, and she insisted she was innocent up to the charges and pleaded to not be sent abroad. However, it fell on deaf ears as she left Woolwich in England on the convict ship Tory on the 22nd of March 1845. On the voyage out, the ship's surgeon described Alexandrina as orderly but precious. When she alighted in Hobart on the 4th of July 1845, she recited an imaginary family to the convict clerk. She said she had a father, John, and her brothers were William, James, Dennis, Alexander, John and Donald, and a sister Elizabeth, all living in Scotland. But no family by this name is on the census, and there is no record of a Dennis Grant anywhere in Scotland before 1901. She was given 6 months probation on her arrival. On the 13th of January 1846 she was changed to 2nd class, and on the 26th of May 1846 it was changed to 3rd class. So in terms of the class system in Tasmania, 1st class was given to women who were recent arrivals from England and they exhibited good behaviour on their journey and had successfully completed their probation in 2nd class. They were considered assignable and could be sent to service where appropriate employment could be obtained. So she reached that when she initially arrived. However, she went down to 2nd class, which comprised of women who'd been guilty of minor offences. They were employed in making clothes and preparing and mending linen, and were generally housed in a female factory. If they went down to 3rd class, this was the lowest rung on the ladder, and these were women that were guilty of misconduct on their journey to the colony, or were convicted of offences before the Supreme Court, or convicted offences within the walls of the establishment. And they were sentenced to the wash tub, laundering for the factory, working in the orphan school and other tasks. On the 31st of January 1846, she was assigned to J. Spode, and she was convicted of misconduct in misrepresenting her abilities and not proceeding to the police office according to her pass. She was given 2 months hard labour in the female factory. On the 17th of February 1846, she was admonished for being absent without leave from her master, Mr. Chelton, and on the 26th of October 1846, she received 6 months hard labour out of chains in the Cascades female factory for again being absent without leave from her master. On the 1st of August 1847, she absconded from Mr. Dobson in Hobart, and when she was in the Brickfields hiring depot on the 28th of August 1847, she again was absent without leave and received 4 months hard labour. On the 17th of February 1848, she was assigned to Reverend James Norman in Sorel and Miss Dixon of Hobart in May 1848. She was charged with absconding. She was apprehended at Mr. O'Hee's public house in the New Wharf. She received 6 months hard labour and the first 3 months doing time in solitary working cells. On the 10th of November 1848, it's noted that she was to be sent to Ross and not allowed to memo the registrar. On the 14th of December 1848, she was absent from her master, Mr Crown, and received 4 months' hard labour in the Cascades female factory. She was heavily pregnant at this time and gave birth to an illegitimate child in the female factory on the 14th of January 1849, John Roderick Grant, and he was baptised 2 days after his birth. I'm unable to find any further information on this child other than his birth and baptism certificates. She spent most of her sentence in the female factories, and on the 27th of April 1850 her ticket of leave was revoked as she was absent from her authorised place of residence and received a week in the cells. On the 10th of June 1850 she appeared in the Hobart Lower Court. At the time she was assigned to W. Clark of O'Brien's Bridge. She received 7 months' hard labour in the Cascades female factory for being absent, and it was noted on her record she was not allowed to be in service in Hobart from that time on. On the 4th of March 1851 she was assigned in Swansea, on the 28th of March in Meredith, but she told her master a falsehood and she was sentenced to 3 months' hard labour in the Ross female factory. She was in Ross on the 20th of May 1851, and on the 25th of September 1851 she was free by servitude. On the 12th of January 1852, her certificate of freedom was issued, with her sentence expiring a week later. A month after her sentence expired, she departed from Launceston on the ship the Shamrock, bound for Melbourne as a steerage passenger, with her status being free. Alexandrina married William Askew in 1852 in Victoria. They went to the gold mines at Bulldog, now Bullerook, near Piggereet. Her swindling career forced them to relocate to Ballarat, then Echuca, and finally Sydney. She had 10 children, 6 of whom lived into middle life, and she successfully delivered and reared the illegitimate child of her second daughter under the common fiction that that child was her own. She first features in the Victorian papers with her misdemeanours on the 19th of November 1867 in the Ballarat Star. False pretences. Alexandrina Askew was brought up on a charge of having obtained, under false pretences, the sum of £18 from Mrs Wise. This is the woman who, it appears, has been victimising a number of persons in various parts of the country. She appeared to be substantially dressed, of middle age, and certainly not anything like prepossessing appearance, although in the course of her travels her matronly appearance and port may have enabled her to pass herself off as a squatter's wife. She was accompanied by a boy about 10 years of age, dressed in a Highland costume, which seemed considerably disarranged with the night's incarceration. She made no reply to the charge, and on the application of Mr Ryle was remanded to Buninyong to be dealt with the following day. And on the 23rd of November 1867 in the Melbourne Leader, a lady swindler. The following account of the adventuress supplied by a correspondent is too good to be lost. A very clever series of depredations have recently been perpetrated by a lady swindler, as she is termed by the victims. It appears that for a length of time the lady has been in the habit of visiting lodging houses and inquiring for apartments. Having satisfied herself of the respectability of the house, she proceeds to inquire into the character of the neighbourhood, and having obtained the fullest information of the next-door neighbour, she takes her leave with a promise to call again. Her next procedure is to call at one of the houses near, if they be lodging houses, stating that she has been recommended by the person she first visited. She describes herself as the wife of a squatter whose station is situated near Piggereet, and that she requires the apartments for herself and her husband. Having agreed to take the lodgings, she proceeds to pay a deposit, when on feeling on her pocket she cries, "I've lost my purse, they've stolen my purse," and she commences to lament and bemoan her loss and exclaiming, "What shall I do? What will my husband say?" The landlady naturally takes compassion on her forlorn condition and promptly offers her the loan of a few pounds to alleviate her distress until she has time to communicate with her husband. The offer is accepted after many refusals, and the would-be lodger goes on her way rejoicing never to return again. Such are the facts as told in upwards of a dozen cases reported to the police, and there seems little doubt that the lady in each case is the same. The lady is always accompanied by a little boy, dressed in Highland costume, whose tears mingled with the sobs of his mother are the secret of the facility of which she accomplishes her schemes. The last we've heard of Mistress Askew is that the highly respectable borough of Richmond was honoured with her presence on the 13th. On that day she patronised the drapery establishment of Mr Sterling on Bridge Road, accompanied by the inevitable lad with the auburn hair, and after inspecting large quantities of goods, made a selection to the extent of £10. She was about to pay the amount of her purchases, but that horrid purse was gone, and what in the world was she to do? Oh, of course, she left it after her at home. "Charlie, did you see my purse at home when we were leaving?" He said, "Yes, Mama, I saw it on the dressing table." And she said, "And you, little thief, why did you allow me to come away without it?" But what was she to do now? Mrs Askew was the wife of a squatter and had come to town to make purchases in anticipation of the visit of Prince Alfred. Her external appearance went to corroborate her statement, and Mr Sterling, with that peculiar politeness which always characterises the followers of his line of business, very kindly undertook to forward the goods to the lady's town address. Mrs Askew, in very strong terms, deprecated Mr Sterling's over-confiding spirit. She was a perfect stranger to him, and how could she think of allowing him to do as he proposed? But at last Mrs Askew was prevailed upon to leave her address, a hotel in Swanston Street. The goods were delivered at the house, it being found that the lady was stopping there at the time. Payment of the bill was not, however, pressed for on that occasion, another large order being perhaps anticipated by the vendor. But Mrs Askew left the Earl of Zetland Hotel, as the fashionable intelligence would say, took her merchandise and her little boy with her, and has not since been seen or heard from by the Richmond draper. The same evening that found her at Mr Sterling's was chosen by the lady to visit also the coachmaking establishment of Mr Dickinson, situated on the same road. Here she was attracted by a buggy which stood for sale outside the door, and by making inquiries into the merits and the price of the conveyance, with the air of one prepared to purchase on reasonable terms, she ingratiated herself into the goodwill of Mr Dickinson, who eventually invited her to partake of some excellent sherry, which, to use the expressive words of Mr Dickinson himself, she polished off with the greatest alacrity. Mrs Askew now became most communicative, imparted to her host her elevated position in society, and spoke of family matters with a surprising ease and confidence. Mr Dickinson's daughter attracted the particular attention of the guest, and on learning that the young lady was suffering from ill health, she pressed her father to allow Miss Dickinson to accompany her to her husband's station and stay with them for a few days, where the delightful salubrity of the country air would be sure to have a beneficial effect on her constitution. It was ultimately arranged that the young lady would meet Mrs Askew at the Spencer Street railway station the next day at 3 o'clock. After waiting for tea, Mr Dickinson's newly acquired aristocratic friend took her departure, with many expressions of hope that the friendship so abruptly begun would be long continued and sincere. Miss Dickinson kept the appointment at Spencer Street the next day, but unfortunately the two friends, by some unaccountable circumstance, missed each other. Mrs Askew has not returned to conclude negotiations for the purchase of the buggy, and there seems to be little likelihood that the friendship so pleasantly begun and promising so bright a future is to be characterised either by continuity or sincerity. Mr Dickinson, however, may congratulate himself that his loss extended no further than a fleeting acquaintanceship. Where Mrs Askew may next turn up we cannot dream, but it appears to be the opinion of some of the members of the police force that if they met this clever lady in the street at any moment, they would not be justified in arresting her on a charge of obtaining goods or money under false pretences. She has been shrewd enough on every occasion to avoid directly asking for anything. Vagrancy, it is said, is the only tangible charge that can be brought against her. It is supposed that Mrs Askew is not wholly unaided in her adventures, but that there is one behind the scenes in whose hands she is merely an instrument. The Lady Swindler, who has lately been victimising the inhabitants of the ancient city of Buninyong, was brought up at the Eastern Police Court, Ballarat, on Monday morning, charged with obtaining the sum of £18 under false pretences. The lady in question, Alexandrina Askew, appeared in the court expensively dressed and conducted herself in a manner which explained how she has been so successful in practising upon the credulity of the victims. The warrant for her arrest having been issued at Buninyong, she was remanded there. The Lady Swindler, Alexandrina Askew, was brought before the Buninyong Police Court on Tuesday and again remanded, the police not having obtained the necessary evidence. In connection with the case of this distinguished character, we understand that a short time since she left a vast quantity of valuable goods, consisting of shawls and dresses, with the landlady of the halfway house at Mount Clear, who in return accommodated her with a shawl. The latter has not been returned, so Mrs Northage declines to give up the property deposited with her, the value of which is roughly estimated at £200. And on the 2nd of December 1867 in the Melbourne Age, the Ballarat Courier relates that a new phase has turned up in connection with the exploits of Mrs Alexandrina Askew, which makes it probable that she will soon escape from the clutches of the police. It seems her husband has lately visited the people with whom she victimised and announced his intention of reimbursing them for their losses. He states that she has occasionally exhibited symptoms of aberration of intellect and surmises that her depredations have been committed while under what our inimitable jester Barlow would term fluence. There is some cogency in this hypothesis, as Mr Askew is a well-to-do farmer residing near Colac, and according to all accounts has been no niggard in supplying his wife with the means necessary to support her position in life. Mr Askew has already recouped some of his wife's victims and promises to pay the rest at an early date. Under these circumstances, it's fair to presume she will soon be liberated from custody, as, if troubled with fits of insanity, it would be impossible to prove felonious intent. And in the Melbourne Age on the 5th of December 1867, Mrs Alexandrina Askew, the lady swindler, was brought up at the Buninyong Police Court on Tuesday, charged with obtaining £18 and a black leather purse from Ellen Wise under false pretences. The prosecutrix deposed that the prisoner came to her house about 10 o'clock in the morning and asked her if her name was Thompson, to which she replied no, and gave the name of Askew. She said she was the wife of a squatter and that her husband had erected an engine at Moonlight Flat. After some further conversation, the prisoner asked the way to Scorers, and she undertook to conduct her there. On the way, the prisoner said she would give her a tow, and then expressed a desire to rent a buggy to go to Ballarat. The prosecutrix said she would lend her a buggy, and the prisoner thanked her, stating that if she went to Mrs Scorers, she would have to give her a silk gown. The two then returned to the house, and the prosecutrix went into her bedroom and brought out her purse, from which she gave the prisoner £3. After which she gave her a £5 note and a £10 note. The bench said that Mrs Wise's evidence nullified the charge. She'd done a very foolish thing to lend the money, and the prisoner must be discharged. Then the prisoner was charged with obtaining £8 under false pretences from Mary Armstrong of Carlton. The sergeant of police asked for a remand to Melbourne, which was granted. The prisoner to be brought up there on Tuesday next. Bail in 2 sureties of £50 each was allowed. So on the 7th of December 1867, the lady swindler Alexandrina Askew was brought before the Eastern Police Court on Friday on one of the many charges of obtaining money and goods under false pretences, which have been lately laid against her. But as it appeared, as in the other case, the property has been voluntarily given to her in a way of a loan, and the case was dismissed. The particular charge against her this time was for obtaining a shawl and cape at the value of 40 shillings from Joseph Andrews, a resident of Dalton's Flat. One evening the accused came to his house complaining of fatigue through being led away into the bush by a young man where she had for a time lost herself. Andrews accommodated her with bed and breakfast, and in the morning lent her a cape and shawl and 30 shillings in money. The loan being a voluntary one, the charge fell through and the prisoner was discharged. Mrs Askew has one more police court ordeal to go through, which, if passed with the same degree of safety, says a courier, as the two she's undergone, will altogether emancipate her from the vigilance of police authorities. So on the 10th of December 1867 in the Melbourne Argus, Alexandrina Askew, a middle-aged woman who has recently attained some notoriety by means of her swindling practices, was charged at the City Court yesterday obtaining money from Mrs Armstrong of Carlton by false pretences. The external appearance of Alexandrina Askew in the dock was certainly the opposite of those richly jewelled and elegantly attired accounts which have appeared in previous journals. It appears that on the 11th of November, Mrs Askew called at Mrs Armstrong's and stated that her husband was worth £16,000 and that he kept a station. She afterwards stated that she'd had lost her purse containing a cheque of £16 and asked Mr Armstrong for a loan of £5. £3 was lent to her, and Mrs Askew, after promising to send Mrs Armstrong some present from the station, left the house. She then called upon Mrs Buchanan of Fitzroy, but fortunately for the latter, she had no money in the house. Mrs Armstrong said that she asked for £5 and she gave her £3, believing her story to be true. She promised to return the money the following day. She also said she would pay me 2 to 1 or double. I never saw her afterwards. She promised to give me a cow, a quantity of cheese, butter and eggs, and would always be my friend. When she first came to the fence of my yard, she said I was not the person she wanted. I then asked her to walk in. She said she would very much like to see my brother. She asked me to lend her some money. She asked for £5 and I gave her £3. She said she would telegram her husband on the following day and pay me back, double the amount. She did not mention either her husband's name or her own. She said her husband was residing in the country and in consequence of his having to attend to 5 children, he was unable to attend Melbourne. The defendant had been 20 years in the colony and during 9 years had been in charge of a store. She had been sent to town by her husband, but having expended the funds allowed her for the occasion, she resorted to the devices which she had been charged for the purpose of raising money. And on the 12th of December in the Melbourne Argus, it says, "The Ballarat and Buninyong magistrates have discharged her. The magistrate sitting in our city court remanded her, and now she's waiting to see what the Geelong justices will have to say to her some day this week. It is not unlikely that she may slip through the fingers of justice after all, although by her own admission she's been guilty of a series of grossly dishonest acts. Under what kleptomaniacal or other bad influence this woman came to leave her comfortable home at Colac and her 5 children to go roaming about the colony, levying contributions upon the public, we need not now stay to inquire. She's in the hands of the law, and unless a plea of insanity can be maintained on her behalf, the probability is that by and by she will find herself in a tight place. And if her mental condition is made the subject of scientific investigation, we think it's highly probable that Mrs Askew is insane, but her insanity has a method in it which we cannot discover in the extraordinary conduct of the many persons who permitted themselves to be deceived by her transparently false pretences. Let us glance at her mode of procedure. Her first adventure was to drop into the cottage of a small settler in the bush between Buninyong and Smythesdale with an absurd story about a broken buggy, and that she managed to extract a considerable sum of money from the silly woman of the house under the pretence that she would aid the husband of her victim in obtaining some land. By and by she appeared in Richmond and obtained from a tradesman there a considerable quantity of goods by representing herself to be the wife of a rich squatter. On the same day she called upon a coachmaker in the same locality and entered into a pleasant conversation with him. She was presently invited into his family parlour to partake in wine, after which the new acquaintance ripened quickly. She was persuaded to stay for tea, and before long she had so completely won the confidence and esteem of the coachmaker and his womenfolks that an invitation had been given and accepted under which one of the daughters of the house would pay a visit of some duration at the lady's country seat. What advantage Mrs Askew hoped to gain by humbugging this simple-minded family and obtaining a loan of one of its members under a false pretence, it is impossible to guess. This episode in her career certainly goes far to prove her insanity. Had she obtained a buggy or even a perambulator in addition to the refreshments so kindly lavished upon her return for her foolish account of her own and her husband's wealth and greatness, her conduct would be explicable. But to entice a young person away from her home only that she might give her the slip at the railway station was as gratuitously preposterous as the conduct of the young person's parents in letting her leave on such a fool's errand. A little later we find Mrs Askew operating in Carlton. Addressing a woman over a yard fence, she told her that she was the wife of a squatter worth £16,000 and the owner of 2 stations, and that she'd lost her purse. These are a few of the tales now being told on oath against Mrs Askew in various courts of petty sessions throughout the colony, and it's hardly conceivable that the relators would publicly charge themselves with such folly unless they'd really been guilty of it. Some of the reporters who were called upon to deal with Mrs Askew in the earlier stages of her predatory career credited her with certain personal and other advantages, which, had she really possessed them, would have palliated in some degree the conduct of her victims. She was variously described as a person of respectable appearance, fashionable exterior, and prepossessing manners, and the inference was that her victims had succumbed to one or the other of her many gifts and graces. But in truth she is nothing of all this. In their laudable desire to enrich their copy and make the most of somewhat infrequent opportunity, the reporters endowed her with qualities to which in reality she had no claim, being a perfectly commonplace-looking woman with nothing noticeable in her manner but a somewhat vacant appearance, and her mode of operating was in the highest degree awkward and inexpert. A strange woman entered a shop, and still more a private house, and opening with a detailed account of her husband's wealth and her own greatness would immediately arouse suspicion in the mind of any person of ordinary discernment, and the success that Mrs Askew met with is strongly corroborative of Mr Carlyle's opinion that people are mostly fools. If the world's business is generally conducted as the many victims of this alleged lady thief seem to have conducted theirs, the wonder is that false pretence and other descriptions of fraud are not more numerous than they are. When persons with the care of money are seen to give them up to the first person who demands them, on no matter how transparently absurd a pretext, your lady thief has but to tell her little tale, and credulous shopkeepers and housekeepers accept it as gospel and give up to her whatever she may choose to demand. We do not know that there is any likelihood that Mrs Askew's adventures and their being made public will have much effect in warning credulous persons against this sort of false pretenders and other impostors, sane or insane. We call attention to the story of this alleged lady thief in the hope that some few will ponder it and profit by the lesson with which it teaches us forcibly. On the 18th of December in the Melbourne Age, the Lady Swindler. Alexandrina Askew was charged with obtaining money by false pretences from a widow in Carlton. Mr Walker for the defence produced an affidavit made by the husband of the prisoner, who's a settler in the neighbourhood of Bulldog, in which he declared his willingness to pay the amounts obtained by his wife if she was discharged. Mr Sturt postponed his decision until the other charges had been investigated against the prisoner, and Mrs Trotter, an aged lady residing in East Collingwood, who lent her £1, and Mr Mackenzie of Emerald Hill, who lent her £3, were examined, but their statements were not taken down, as it was shown the money was given as a loan. Mr Sturt said he must discharge the prisoner on all charges. Mr Superintendent Littleton then intimated that he should rearrest the prisoner under the Vagrant Act. So 2 days later, that occurred. Alexandrina Askew was again brought before the court on a warrant issued under the Vagrant Act, charging her with imposing upon Eliza Mackenzie, a single woman keeping a boarding house in Franklin Street, North Melbourne. The prosecutrix repeated the statement which has been reported as to how the prisoner came to her on the evening of the 23rd of August, saying she was the wife of a wealthy squatter at Piggereat Station. She knew all of prosecutrix friends at Ballarat and had accidentally left her purse behind and was in want of money, and in short, how she succeeded in getting £5 out of her, on the strength of some shallow lies of this kind. Some evidence having been taken, the case on the application of Superintendent Littleton was remanded till Tuesday. And as a result, she was sent to jail for 14 days as a warning, being informed that if she borrowed any more of a similar manner, that she would be treated to 12 months imprisonment. Mr Sturt said that in consideration of the prisoner having been locked up for 5 weeks, the sentence would be a comparatively light one. Had each of the charges against the prisoner been proceeded with separately, the sentences would have been cumulative. Then on the 10th of January 1868, the notorious Alexandrina Askew, having concluded a sojourn of 14 days in Melbourne jail, was yesterday conveyed to Geelong to answer a charge of obtaining money by false pretences from Mr Campbell of Little River. There's a second charge against her of obtaining a silk cloak and a £5 note from Mrs Macpherson of Melbourne, and she's also accused of obtaining £2 from Mrs Brown. And then on the 13th of January 1868, Mrs Alexandrina Askew will shortly make her appearance before that of Bacchus Marsh on the charge of defrauding Mr W MacDonald of £6. On Friday, this persecuted person was remanded at Geelong on 2 charges of fraud. And in the Melbourne Age on the 15th of January 1868, at the Geelong Court, the first witness called was Mrs Mary Campbell of Little River, who deposed on the 14th of November the prisoner called at her place, and after some conversation said she lost her pocketbook and asked her to lend her £2, saying at the same time that she was the wife of Mr Macpherson, owner of Buninyong Station, and that she wanted the money to take her to Ballarat, where she had friends. The witness gave her the money and she went away promising to return it the next day, but never did so. Mr Harwood, after cross-examining the witness, said the case must break down, as the witness simply lent his client the money on the representation of being a squatter's wife, no evidence to prove the contrary having been brought forward, nor to show that her statement with regard to the lost purse was untrue, or as to whether her name was Askew instead of Macpherson. After further questioning, the bench dismissed the case. The second charge of obtaining from Mrs Elizabeth Macpherson of Lethbridge £5 and a cloak under similar circumstances was also discharged. A third charge of obtaining £2 and a Paisley shawl from Mrs Janet Brown of Geelong on the 9th of November also broke down on the grounds that the loan was volunteered and not asked for by the prisoner. Immediately on the prisoner, who carried a young child in her arms, leaving the court, she was again arrested by the police on a warrant to attend Bacchus Marsh, charged with being a roving vagabond without any lawful or visible means of support. In part 2, I'll be covering the case at Bacchus Marsh, and to see what became of Alexandrina Askew and whether she continued with these misdemeanours.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.